My friends, much like Plato, I am finding myself questioning democracy. Did you see video of the Oval Office, Donald Trump and JD Vance berating and yelling at Ukrainian President Zelensky? And maybe you said to yourself, maybe Plato was onto something. Maybe letting ignorant clowns decide how we run our country is a bad idea. Now, before the MAGA people start flipping out, I'm not actually calling for the suspension of democracy the way they did multiple times. I am pro democracy, but this is sort of a thought experiment. And I do find myself feeling like Plato did. Now, I'm not saying let's put in some dictator or philosopher king. I am saying Plato's biggest fear about democracy is playing out in real time right now in the United States. What Plato said was that unchecked democracy will eventually fail under its own stupidity or the stupidity of the average voter. If you let everyone vote, as we do in democracies, at least supposedly, if you're uninformed, if you're detached from reality, you're still allowed to vote. And when that's the case, eventually the loudest and the most shameless liars will win. The ignorant will end up in charge. And what are we seeing today? We're seeing a con man reality TV show host with dozens of felony charges as president of the United States. We're seeing the guy who bragged about, I'm going to be a dictator on day one, is the president. We're seeing the guy who gives unqualified friends and family jobs be the president. The guy who yells at the Ukrainian president while kowtowing to the Russian dictator is the president. And this is really not about left and right. This is simply about whether facts, logic, and basic reality can survive when millions of people prefer entertaining nonsense over the truth. And MAGA is the sort of final boss of entertaining nonsense. It's really Plato's nightmare. Now, democracy assumes an informed electorate. It assumes that people will act in their own best interests. But what happens when a significant chunk of voters are so propagandized to, so ignorant, and so detached from reality that they can't even recognize a scam or what's truly in their best interests? What happens when they actively vote for their own destruction? MAGA voters cheer when Trump says he wants to gut Social Security because of fraud. They applaud when Trump brags about giving tax cuts to billionaires while they're struggling to afford groceries because it's going to be pro-growth and great for everybody. They chant his name when he calls for shutting down the government programs that they depend on. They pray at the altar of Trump when he proposes tariffs that they are going to end up paying for. So maybe Plato had a point, because Plato warned that democracy left to its own devices eventually will elect the worst among us, and that if enough voters reject expertise and reject reason and choose leaders based on who yells the loudest, democracy is going to eat itself. And here we are. So what do? What we don't do is we don't sit back and kind of wait for a magic genie to fix it all. We need to stop treating ignorant, propagandized voters like an unfortunate side effect of democracy and say this is an existential crisis. This is not the way democracy was supposed to work. Because if Plato was correct and democracy is doomed to collapse under the weight of its own stupidity, the only real way forward is to fight like hell for an informed democracy, if we still believe that for all of its failings, democracy is the best system we've come up with. I tend to still believe that it is. And so I want to be clear that I'm not actually calling for the suspension of democracy. What I am pointing out is that when the population, when the electorate gets as painfully ignorant and uninformed and is so easy to bamboozle as we are seeing here in the United States, we end up with really unqualified, dangerous people in power. And once you open that door, once the genie is out of the bottle, to stick with that, it's extraordinarily difficult to get it back in. And that's what we are seeing. I mean, as we started the show today, and I said, most of the world sees the Oval Office fiasco with Trump, JD, and Zelensky as embarrassing for the United States. Most of the world has said, oh, wow, the US is really going full dictator and saying the dictator who invaded is the guy we should defer to. And the democratically elected president who's defending his country needs to be berated and yelled at in the Oval Office. Most of the world said we should come to the defense of Zelensky here. Here in the United States, a lot of MAGAs saw that and said, good for Trump and JD for being tough. Now, I didn't mention this earlier, and it does bear mentioning. I don't know how many of you noticed Secretary of State Marco Rubio sitting next to JD during that. You can't always know what people are thinking from how they look. But by all accounts, Marco Rubio looked disgusted with what was going on. He seemed disgusted with the way that Trump and JP Mandel were treating Vladimir Zelensky. And so my suspicion is, and I'm going to talk to some Republicans kind of off the record this week, my suspicion is that a large share of the Republican Party right now did not like that and were not impressed and are not impressed with the way in which Tulsi and Trump and JD and others are more and more kind of favoring Putin. We will see.